Hello and welcome back to Scale War Machines and this simple beginner's guide to building and painting a resin figure. This is what we're going to be using. It's the Nuts Planet NP001 reference, which is a Deutsche Afrika Korps or D.A.K figure. It's an SD figure, so of course the proportions are cartoonish and it's not true to life, but it's a fun subject. I built and painted this back in 2015, and of course the material used is resin. So when it comes to resin figures, of course the procedures and processes are different because the material's different. All the components are moulded, and that means there'll be pouring plugs and various other little features that you wouldn't necessarily get on a plastic injection moulded product. So what are the tools that you need? Well, you'll need a variety of scalpels and saws, and these will mainly be used for removal of plugs and for cleanup. Here you can see how I proceeded. I used a razor saw to remove some of the bigger items. This is one by Revel, and it comes with a variety of different sized blades. You can of course also remove little stubs of moulding material with side cutters, and you can see during this whole sequence that I progressed through various types of saws and razor saws in order to separate all the moulding plugs and clean up all the items. Don't forget, you can drill out with a mini drill various components and pin them, and that will help you glue things on, like the head. When you've got everything, it's quite normal to find little seam lines or moulding lines on the pieces. That's all due to the casting process, and these are quite easily cleaned up using a sharp blade. You can also use sanding sticks, of course, to remove any of the residues or marks from the casting process. I use these Swan Morton scalpels generally. You can get cheap non-surgical blades easily enough on something like eBay and Amazon. Most of the components are cleaned up, and I thought ahead to the base, and in this case you can see that it has been drilled and pinned. I simply drilled out the resin terrain feature that comes with the kit and drilled out the wooden plinth or base. I then used a wooden stick to add strength to the join and superglued the two together. I could then continue with construction of the figure itself with the cleaned up parts, and this is again one of the differences with resin as opposed to plastic. You need to use cyanoacrylate or superglue. In this case I'm using Rocket superglues from Deluxe Materials, and I've done videos on these products before. What you want to do is dry fit everything, make sure it fits, test the position and so on, especially with a figure, to make sure the look is right. And then what you can do is use a variety of different superglue products. Deluxe Materials makes them in very low viscosity and very high viscosity, and choose an appropriate superglue product to glue everything together. Just be careful because the Rocket Hot, for example, which is their most runny or low viscosity glue, can really flow all over the place, so be careful. Here you can see it's been glued together. The superglue's done a good job, everything's looking right, the pose is appropriate. Time to fill in the gaps, which are inevitable on any resin figure. In this case I used Perfect Plastic Putty, which is a water-based filler putty from Deluxe Materials, and again I've featured this in videos before and made videos on it for the manufacturer. I really like it because it's water-based. You can just clean everything up with water. In this case you can also put it in a syringe, which is what I did to get the putty into the places I really wanted it. It's a good product, and as you can see, thanks to the water cleanup, it did a quick job of filling the gaps and making the figure look complete. We're now pretty much ready for painting. When it came to painting I used an airbrush. You don't have to, of course, if you're a brush painter, but this was the Sand Surface Primer from MIG, reference on screen. This was sprayed using my Iwata HPCH airbrush and an Iwata Neo compressor. I was using that as part of an early test on the channel. What you want to do is just get an even coating of the paint, build up several layers, and you'll see that this product, along with many other surface primers, does a great job of giving you a base to work from. Now, here's a hack for the eyes. I used a product from Archer, which is sadly no longer in existence, but it is a great product, and even though it took me a few goes, their human eye decals are a fantastic cheat for doing eyes. You can of course paint them. Now, I had a bit of trouble with this. I don't know whether it was an old pack or whether it had decayed or degraded in some way, but a lot of the decals or transfers melted away when I applied them to the model. But eventually I found some that worked, and all in all it was a time saving from painting it myself. I've done a video on these transfers, although as I say, sadly they're hard to get now or impossible because the company has ceased trading. Nevertheless, they're easy enough to apply, like a typical water slide decal. And once I got round the degrading or breaking up of them and found ones that worked, they were easy enough to position. And I'm using microscale, microset and microsol decal setting solution to help with their application. You can even see on the right hand eyeball that it just started to break up slightly when I was applying it, but I managed to keep it all together, and that remained on the figure right till the end and was fine. And there we go. A relatively quick and easy solution to getting eyeballs done. Now, so much is going to go on around the face, it doesn't matter if there's a slight problem with them. In terms of painting faces, this was the first time in 2015 that I used Lifecolor, and I used their flesh painting set, which is an excellent set. Now, I've come to love these paints, along with several other brands, but I really like their flesh paints. In terms of painting the face then, what I do usually at this stage is frame the eyes, and I did that using their Flesh Shadow number 2 reference. And I'll put all the references on screen so you can see, but it's the second shadow, the darkest colour. And that's almost used like mascara to paint around and frame the eyes. That's why that will address any problems and issues you may have had with things like the painting of the eyeball, because already you're starting to narrow it and make it smaller and make the face more about the flesh than the eyes. So this dark shadow colour can be used in all recesses and shadow areas, including around the hairline, in the ears, around the mouth and so on. And you get something like that. Now I started to block out and paint around all that framing using Flesh Second Base, which is a fantastic dark flesh shade. Now, I was new to these paints at the time and I used them a lot wetter than I would now. In other words, I'm wet blending them. But either way, what you want to do is just block out the face with this dark flesh tone. And then it's going to be lightened slightly using their next flesh shade reference on screen, which is of course lighter, and I wet blended that on the face, so blending the lighter colour into the dark colour. Again, I'm not sure I'd do it this way nowadays, but it does work, as you can see. What I'm doing is attempting to get the lighter mix on all the highlights, so the top of the cheekbones, the nose, the ridge of the nose. You also want to pick out highlight features like the earlobes, the Adam's apple, the neck protrusions and so on. Again, working wet on the model as opposed to using something like a wet palette here. But they are a pleasure to blend and easy to blend. Now onto the first highlight, so the lightest of the flesh colours. And it's the same procedure, starting with the most prominent areas, in this case his big bulbous nose, then the nostrils, top of the cheekbones. And again, because the paint is relatively wet underneath, it's quite easy just to blend it all together. I think how my technique has evolved is now I would probably dry brush or blend those with a dry brush, whereas here I'm blending them wet in effect. And it really is just a case of reworking it over and over again. Go back to the lightest shade, what they call the first light, and just hit everything again and again until you get the pop or the glow of the highlight. I'm not always using the same brush, I am switching brushes, and that helps to blend everything. And we get something like that. It's already starting to take shape, relatively pleased with it, but you can see I'm going back to the mixes again and again. As the paint dries, and this is where these Lifecolor paints really work, you start to build on top of it. Okay, here I am choosing one of the mid-tone colours and just going over everything again. In this case I'm trying to add mid-shadows or mid-tones, and what I do in effect is underline things like the eyes and try and create a join between the darker shadows I did previously and the lighter work I'd done. Then, and this is slightly unusual, I went back to the darkest shadows and reapplied those in certain areas and then blended them. So for example, around the hairline, around the base of the cap, I am in effect creating the darkest of dark shadows. This can even apply as a shadow under the peak of the cap. Now at this stage I almost felt like I'd gone forwards and then backwards. Wouldn't necessarily do that now, but I think the key is to realise that you just keep doing what you've done before. What was motivating me was that I don't think it looked contrasty enough. I wanted to really make sure that it reflected the elements and the stark sunlight in the desert and so on. So here again, using a wet fine tip brush, I'm adding a sort of 5 o'clock shadow and just making sure there's lots and lots of shadow around the eyes, mouth and nose. This is another angle as I continue that work. You can see it's the flesh second shadow reference. And then using the previous colours, including for example the flesh base, I just repeat what I did in the earlier stages. So I'm going back to the mid-tones and then I'll go back to the highlights. This time though, what I'm doing is painting on detail rather than just general broad brush stroke mixes. I'm trying to pick out things like detail in the face, eye lines and what have you, and you can see because I'm using the paint dryer and the base coat has dried, I can actually blend it a lot more effectively and create better highlights. Mustn't forget the arms of course, so I paint all the arms in the relevant flesh shades. With layers drying in between coats now, I pick the second highlight and also later I'll go to the first highlight and I outline things like the lips, the structure around the eyes, the cheekbones, and it starts to get a bit more definition in the face. Also, as you can see, the paints go on really well over a dry base. This is the brightest highlight and we're nearing the end now. With this brightest highlight I paint fine details like the top of the earlobes, the structure of the ear. And you can see at this stage, because everything's drier underneath, I use a dry brush just to blend things, so a flat dry brush just to feather the edges between all the colours. I don't always do that, so for example sometimes I'll do fine lines that remain clean and distinct. But if I want to blend something I reach for a very small Lifecolor or other brand flat brush. Here I am outlining the lips, creating a highlight on the top of the lips. And there it's a little bit too stark, but I'll probably go on and blend it later. You can see how with a really fine brush you can just carefully apply highlights to specific areas. And these are really the most prominent or striking features of the face. And of course that big old nose gets a really prominent highlight as it appears from underneath the peak of the cap. And here's how it is. Some final very thin detail painting. Just final touches to complete the figure and final blends with flat brushes. As I tackle the hair, which I'll do in the next video, I make sure the hairline has a prominent shadow area around it, and this is progress. I'm pretty pleased with that, and it's a great base to start on the uniform, which I'll do in the next video. Thanks for watching, and bye.
Subscribe for our latest videos.